Welcome to Assessment in Focus, the podcast where we invite guests to tell us the real stories of digital assessment transformation, innovation and enhancement. I'm your host, Ishan Kolhatkar, Global Client Evangelist at Inspira, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Phillip Dawson, Phil as I know him, a name familiar to many of you listening. Phil is the co-director of the Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning, better known as Cradle, at Deakin University in Australia, which is the world's leading higher education assessment research group in terms of publications and citations. Phil is most known for his research on feedback, cheating, and artificial intelligence in assessment, and his work is highly cited, ranking 6th internationally in the field of higher education research over the past 5 years. Strap in, this is quite a long intro. In his feedback research, Phil is currently leading an Australian Research Council project into supporting students to make the most of feedback through developing their feedback literacy. This is a longitudinal study that uses behaviour change techniques from the health and social sciences to help students develop and use feedback capabilities not just at university but also in their graduate working lives. In his cheating and AI research, Phil is currently collaborating with Deakin colleagues on a major project into how to design assessment that is valid and appropriate for a time of artificial intelligence. And it builds on work funded by the Australian higher education regulator, TEXA, of which he's one of the leads. Phil is a regular contributor to the public debate on higher education, and his work has been featured on ABC TV in Australia, The Australian, The Age, Times Higher Education, the BBC, Vice, Vox, the Financial Times, and the Geelong Advertiser, and discussed in the Australian Parliament. In his spare time, Phil performs comedy, including the academia-themed improv show The Peer Review, which he also produces, and I should note, has always been on a day or two after I've been in Melbourne, which I'm not holding against him. But most importantly, today, Phil is a guest on Assessment in Focus. And with that long introduction, Phil, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the huge introduction. It's exciting to be here to talk.
I'm delighted that you're excited to be here. And one of the reasons for using that long introduction is actually it's something that I looked at after I wrote the questions and then nicely saw how it linked to so many of them. And that's not so much of a coincidence. There's a reason I invited you to be on the podcast. We've spoken at events before. We spoke in Manchester a couple of years ago and had a great time, so I knew it would be good fun to do that. But you hit upon all the topics that I'm asking people about in this season of the podcast. So I'm going to dive straight into that first question, which is about the evolution of higher education. And my question is, what do you see as the most critical changes needed in assessment practices to better align with the skills that students will need in the future?
So I think, the first thing we need to do is figure out what are those skills. There's a great quote from Dylan Williams. It goes something along the lines of, a lot of the debates we have in assessment are not about assessment per se. They're about what is to be assessed. And, I think we need to figure that one out. What are those really important outcomes, capabilities people need? And, some of that involves going out and talking with industry, finding out, say, with AI, how are you currently using AI? What's the near future look like for you?
And that's what I was going to ask you about, which is with AI, and I'm sorry to cut you off and I'll let you finish your answer in a second, but just taking AI for a second, how are we to know what those skills are when we're still trying to figure out ourselves how we're going to use AI?
It's really hard, and I think this links in with debates around sort of, will we see artificial general intelligence? Because if we do see that, AI that's capable of whatever a professional in a field is capable of, it raises big questions about, do we train people to do those things still? Do we train them to do other things? Some people are AI doomers, thinking it's not going to get there, and they will remind us that during sort of the rapid boom of the aviation industry, where planes were going faster and faster, some airlines were selling tickets to the moon because they genuinely believed that we would be flying to the moon very soon in airplanes. So yeah, you got to figure your way through that one first. I think there are some things though that are probably going to be evergreen. And one of them that my centre has really pushed is a thing called evaluative judgment, which is your ability to make decisions about the quality of work, your own work and the work of other people. And it includes the work of AI. You know, to put it really bluntly, we need to know if AI is giving us garbage. And I think that skill is going to be a really persistent thing people need regardless of what happens.
And that's linked beyond AI, isn't it? It's we live in an era of the term fake news, without wishing to turn the podcast political, but that evaluative judgment isn't tied to AI. This is something that is wholly necessary, as you say, for anything that we do. How do we teach people to be more evaluative and critical in what they're seeing, whether it's AI or not?
Yeah, look, I really agree with you. It has always been a thing that you know what quality looks like, that you can make judgments about it, that you can raise concerns if things aren't good enough quality. Yeah, you go to hospital, you get surgery done. It matters that the team could do the job, but it also matters that the team know the job has been done to a sufficient standard. They both really matter. And the ways that we develop evaluative judgment in people are quite diverse. One of the most obvious things is you get people to make judgments. So you give them work samples and you say, you are the assessor, you judge this. Here's an exemplar of the work done. Here's 3 exemplars. Which ones are the best? Which ones are the worst? And why? What's your critique of them? When it comes to using AI, it's, a lot of people have been doing activities of, get the AI to do the thing and then you make judgments about the quality of AI's output. And I think there's a role for that.
When we're thinking about tying this back to assessment practices, I know that there's been an explosion in getting people to write reflective statements, which I think have something of a purpose, but that's not the same as evaluative judgment in terms of what you were saying a moment ago about taking work and saying which one's good, better, best, or which one passes and which one fails. I mean, though I've seen some practice of it, it's not commonplace that we're asking students to do that. Is that the kind of thing that we ought to be building into assessments, whether at formative or at summative stage, to say, part of your assessment is, can you pick good from this? Can you pick right from this?
Yeah, I think we absolutely need to be doing that. I think sometimes when people are, you got some guru selling some assessment practice or whatever, it just sounds like a lot of work. If I can sell this as less work to people, I will. So when you do an assessment task with me, you self-assess on a copy of the rubric. I'm in a context where we just have to use rubrics. So you self-assess on a copy of the rubric. I assess you on another copy of the rubric. And then the detailed feedback conversation focuses on our difference in judgment about the quality of your work. So that is you exercising that evaluative judgment muscle. And then me not telling you, hey, thought you were bad at that and you were bad at that. There's not a lot of point to that conversation. But it's, hey, you thought that wasn't up to scratch, but I thought it was, and here's why. So it's sort of in addition to a usual process of feedback, it's feedback comments that help to calibrate that evaluative judgment.
And it so neatly aligns to the world of work. I mean, it's many people watching this, listening to this, will be subject to quarterly reviews at work where you're asked to evaluate yourself. Your boss is asked to do the same thing. Most of the time it's done blind, or certainly all mine that I've done have been blind. And then you look at those differences and you say that difference is important. So I can see that link. I just want to go back for a second to talk about it in the context of AI. If we're asking people to be evaluative, then isn't it the case, I'm asking a really loaded question maybe, isn't it the case that using words like hallucination don't help? Because it's not a hallucination, it's just wrong. Shouldn't we be honest about what they're seeing or potentially seeing rather than using euphemistic terms that aren't helping them evaluate.
Look, there's been a whole debate around those terms, and as someone who dropped out of first year philosophy classes, I feel ill-equipped to engage in the philosophy of AI stuff. But, I do think it's helpful to say, here's some AI work and this stuff is completely wrong, and to build that understanding that AI can be wrong and it is often wrong. Doesn't mean it's wrong all the time. And I suspect that over time it's going to get less and less wrong. But even if it's only wrong point something percent of the time, that's still a significant enough amount of the time that we need that critical judgment. And there's also there's right and wrong, which sounds great in a sort of a STEM context, but in humanities, social sciences, etc., it just might not be the perspective that I am wanting to take, or it might not align with this particular theoretical model that we're using here. So it's not wrong, but it's not where I wanted it to go, and I need to be able to spot that.
Which again aligns to the pre-generative AI world, where we were making value judgments about the sources we were reading, and thinking about those two. There is. I realize I'm supposed to be asking questions, and sometimes they're statements. And if any of my former bar students are listening, they are going to pick me up on this, and I will get comments, I know. But I always worry about what we're doing about the technology or the resources that came before the one that's in front of our eyes at the moment. So there's the great meme of someone on the internet is wrong. Is there a danger that as we focus on the right and wrong of AI, we're going to sort of start forgetting about how general sources on the internet can be wrong, and we're going to lose our focus and our evaluative skills outside of AI because we're just concentrating on AI being right?
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. I think we can sometimes have blind trust in some things, and the peer-reviewed research literature is held up as this sort of gold standard of, it's been through this process, it must be okay. But we've seen, in some fields, problems with peer review, in some fields, problems with, replication, where people have done a study, but no one else can seem to get the same results when they follow the same method. That critical capability is something that people need themselves. We can't offload that. I'm reminded that there's all of these tools now that are being sold on YouTube videos to me whenever I watch them of, the news is biased, and we've built a tool that highlights which sources lean this way or that way, and to help you to navigate all of this. But that's a capability I need. I can't offload that to some tool to do all the bias analysis or whatever. I need to develop that critical faculty in myself.
Absolutely. We can't be abrogating that to something else. Or if we are, then I think that there's the duality of it. We can't be abrogating our responsibility to be fact-checking to someone else, but then potentially complain about the fact-checking because we have allowed someone else to do it. So I agree. And I think this is certainly a topic where we could explore a number of areas, but I'm going to move us on to our next question, which is, you've been in higher education for many years now. You and I share a deep, dark secret, which I'm going to uncover to everyone on the podcast, which is we both did a first degree in computer science, but neither of us are a coder now. But we're involved in the world of digitalization within education in what we do. In your experience, what's the most significant barrier to either digital transformation or incremental digitization in higher education, in particular in assessment, and how can institutions overcome that?
So I think we are in contexts where academics have a fair bit of freedom in terms of how they do their work. And I think that's a really good thing. I think the person in the discipline knows how people learn the thing, and they have some great ideas about how to assess it. I think individual academic decisions and workload pressures and all of those things and bringing people along is probably the biggest challenge that I observe. To make this concrete, we are, as a sector in Australia, I'd say, moving towards course-wide assessment or programmatic assessment, degree level assessment, really trying to say, let's stop trying to make every moment of assessment perfectly secure at the module level. Let's look at what can people do at the degree level. The challenge is, where do the workload hours come to do that? How do we coordinate everyone who works in the degree together so that they're part of the conversation and they're able to say what it looks like for someone to have met the standards? So I think a lot of it's that kind of work stuff.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. And there's this idea of we can all work together, and I agree we should all do one coordinated thing as long as it's the one that I picked, because there's always that specific bit about my module, and I get it, and I've been there, and I've been the person who's defended robustly in my career as an academic the bit that I want to assess or that I think is important. So that people change aspect of it. It's interesting that in all the episodes that I've recorded in this season, I've asked this question. It's kind of revealing that you're towards the end of the recordings, but this answer has resonated all the way through. People have always talked about that people change being important, and I would ask you more, but I think we're actually going to touch on some of it with some of the other questions as we look at academic integrity and security that you've mentioned. And so, moving on to that area, one of the things that you have talked about quite a lot, and people will have seen on LinkedIn your recent keynote, is about reframing integrity, cheating, AI as an issue of validity. And these concerns that we have should be seen as a question of validity. I'm actually just going to begin by saying, tell us more. What do you mean by this, and help us understand if people haven't seen or heard your keynote or read any of your publications on this point?
Fantastic. Always love a soapbox. Good. So I shall go straight in. All right. So along with my Cradle colleagues, we wrote a paper with a very simple title, which is Validity Matters More Than Cheating. When we use the word validity, it's a scary word. People think it belongs to psychometricians and all those people. I think it belongs to all of us as educators. Validity is just, are we assessing what we mean to assess? Simple as that. Have a look at the assessment task, have a think about the outcomes that it's meant to assess, and think, does a student doing this allow me to really know if they've met these outcomes? That's validity. Really simple. There don't even need to be any numbers involved at all. Now, there's been a lot of work on academic integrity and cheating over recent decades, and some of that is a moral concern. So some of it's like, it matters morally if the students have done the right thing or not. I'm not going to disagree with that, but I'm going to sideline that for a moment and say there's another reason why cheating is a problem, which is that if someone cheats, we don't know if they've met the outcomes. And to me, that's the most compelling reason for why cheating's a problem in our current higher ed landscape. If someone cheats through their degree and graduates and builds a bridge and that bridge collapses, their personal morality, I don't care as much about. I care that the bridge collapsed because they couldn't do the thing. Now, them not being able to do the thing is a problem of validity. It means our assessments didn't have validity because the person was able to pass them without having met the outcomes. So that's what reframing cheating as a problem of validity does. Now, when we do that, it allows us to think of other problems of validity in that same envelope. So if you have a face-to-face exam that you require people to come to, and I live 3 hours from campus and I can't find a car park when I get there, and I have trait test anxiety, so I underperform in your exam, that's a validity problem. And we've got to weigh that up with the, anti-cheating benefits that the face-to-face exam was supposed to provide and think, oh, what's actually helping validity the most here? So that's sort of the power of the validity argument.
Where I've seen this discussed in potentially a similar way, I'm going to ask you to compare and contrast, is people saying, right, so that means I've got to try and AI proof my assessment. That feels like swinging way too far the other way and not quite addressing your point. So help me. Is it addressing the point? Is it taking too narrow a view on it? Is that the way of trying to assess validity?
Yeah. So if assessing some particular outcomes requires students to not use AI, then we need some sort of supervised, synchronous, some way that we can have confidence they didn't use AI. Yes, so validity will depend in that context on someone not using AI. However, it's totally infeasible to do that most of the time. And what's worse, if we kind of try to do it through things like saying to students, don't you use AI, you naughty student, and then they go and use it, but we don't have a real way to stop that. That really hurts validity because we've set up a task with the assumption of people not using AI and the assumption we can stop them, which I kind of think we can't most of the time. So we've set up our assessment of the outcomes with the idea someone's not using it and they use it. Our ability to judge it has very poor validity. Instead, if we set the task up saying, people are going to use AI, so how do I assess with the assumption of AI use? We no longer have this sort of restriction that everyone thinks is kind of crazy in there. The validity of our judgments there is going to be better.
And this is how potentially, at the moment, it feels like technology is either framed as a threat to integrity or the absolute silver bullet as a solution for catching any form of misconduct. As with most of these things, neither of the absolutes is right. So how can we, and I appreciate there's not one answer that fits all, so help us with as many as you want, how can we use digital tools in the field of assessment to enhance validity, to ensure validity, to promote validity? Massive question, I know, Phil, but over to you. What can we be doing?
Okay, so I guess the first thing is, as you said, name lots of them, because there's no perfect one. And there has never been a perfectly secure exam. The history of exam cheating goes back literally thousands of years to exam cheating devices that were passed down from generation to generation to cheat on Chinese civil service exams. So, there's a long history of the fact that assessment is never secure perfectly. But we can have, to use the Swiss cheese metaphor, we can layer a bunch of different imperfect interventions to give us, a better, more secure approach overall. And I'd point to Kiara Rundle's work here on that. So what might some of those imperfect layers be? There's things like process tracking, so trying to track student production processes over time, and people use various assignment writing platforms to do that. That's one approach. There is actually having synchronous chats with students, so arrange a chat with student to talk about their work. Doesn't have to be a full-blown Viva thing, can just be, hey, how's it going with that? Trying to verify, did they do the thing? How are they going? Remote proctored exams are a thing as well. Huge pros and cons to remote proctored exams. I think anyone who thinks they are a perfect solution is deluded, but similarly, anyone who thinks they're worthless is probably deluded as well. They are somewhere in the middle there as a layer of Swiss cheese. My gosh, there are so many things we could do here. AI detection is another one that's kind of interesting. I'm a bit of a skeptic of AI detection at the student level, but one thing that I think it can do pretty interestingly is if you have AI detection at a task level. So I set a task for students and I say, go away, do this task, don't use AI. And then I don't use AI detection to find out if the individuals used it or not, but I use it across the cohort and I find out actually most people used AI. That's a really interesting piece of information for me as an assessment designer to go, I need to redesign this task. People are using AI.
And it is those layers. I think there's, I agree with the Swiss cheese point. I agree with the different things that you can use and that you need different layers, different things for different contexts. Where do you think the element of choice comes into this for students? I mean, a super personal view is that I think that if you give students a choice of 2 or 3 different ways of meeting the learning outcomes through different forms of assessment, then that, maybe this is naivety, I think if you give them a choice and they find one of those is one that they like, they're less likely to cheat. I mean, if I was allowed to podcast all of my assessments, I'd have podcasted all of them. To be clear, I didn't cheat in any of them, but I wouldn't have been tempted to do so. Can we involve choice in this? And where does that affect validity too? Because is that going to, can choice make it so broad that we're actually, there's different levels of validity for those different types of assessment? Can we keep them within an ambit?
Yeah. Oh, choice is fascinating. So validity is already hard, and adding choice multiplies how hard it is for us. So I think there's a challenge around that, and there's a whole literature on sort of choice in assessment, and a lot of people are very for it. I think it's just hard to say it's comparable across these different options that students have, my ability to judge if they've met the outcome. However, your point about are people less likely to cheat if they're doing something they want to do, in addition to standing up to sort of straightforward, logic, it kind of makes sense, the thing that you're saying. You can also build an argument around a theory called self-determination theory, which is a theory of sort of human motivation. Wendy Sutherland Smith and I, Wendy's a Cradle colleague, wrote a paper about higher education assessment design where we look into this line of argument and the evidence. And yes, if people's intrinsic motivation needs are met through having a sense of autonomy, which is this sort of choice thing, they are less likely to cheat. And there have been studies done that have looked into that. So yeah, choice, powerful for maybe supporting people to do the right thing and maybe enjoy themselves as well, but challenging for validity.
One of your other big areas that it's in your introduction, and I've read your work on it, and many people listening will have done as well, is feedback and feedback literacy. And when I talk about feedback in my context of the teaching I used to do, I talk about the difference between, well, I suppose I'll give the context so that listeners understand. I used to teach, one of the subjects I taught was advocacy, and it's quite personal. It's 12 minutes of someone speaking, and then you're writing your feedback, which you hand to them there and then on a formative basis, and the summative one, of course, is done slightly differently. So at the end of class, I used to hand people their bit of paper which had all my feedback on it. I wouldn't hand it out after each performance because people would then spend their time reading it and not listening to others. But I used to talk about, or I still talk about, the difference between the scoopers and the readers. And the scoopers were the people who'd pick up the piece of paper, because it was still paper then, with one hand, and it would go in one motion directly into their bag, where I suspect it would never see the light of day. And then the others who'd stand there and read it studiously, and I'd get hundreds of questions. And it took a while for me to realise that this wasn't just a matter of how much they cared. It was also about people's ability to interact with feedback and interact with their teacher, to understand how to ask questions. So on that topic of feedback literacy and using feedback effectively, what do you think are the biggest barriers to feedback literacy in higher education?
So I think you paint a great example of the diversity of people's approaches there. And people don't necessarily have feedback literacy coming in, or they have it that worked well in another context, but then what we do in higher education is so different to their school or their workplace or the sporting field or wherever else it is they've been able to really function with feedback well. So I think the first thing is inducting people into how we do stuff here. I think design matters a lot. So you mentioned there the moment of them getting the feedback, but the really important thing with this formative moment, you also mentioned there's a summative moment later, and it's the connection between those two moments that really matters, that they can see, I've got to do something with this for later. In education, it's often a totally okay, as far as it won't totally derail your career. It's an okay thing to like get the feedback and ignore it, because you're probably still going to go okay. But in the workplace, if my boss gives me feedback and I don't action that feedback, that's a very career limiting move for me. So I think there's a lot of things we can do with feedback designs to make it really obvious what I'm meant to do next and how this bit connects to that bit. To link back to something else I said earlier around sort of getting people to make judgments about their own work, the other piece of it is when you do an assignment with me, I get you to make a feedback request. So we give people a whole bunch of feedback that they might not want, and we rarely ask them, what feedback do you want? What are you actually going to use? What's going to be helpful?
And I really like that. I'm actually going to relate it to a non-academic example. I didn't learn to drive until I was 35, and that's because I grew up in London, I had public transport on my doorstep, and clearly I was just intrinsically lazy about learning how to drive. But when I did a 1-week intensive course, and you were asked 5 questions at the beginning, and one of them was, how do you like feedback? And not only did they use that, but they paired you with the right instructor, because you're going to spend a week with this person. And I said, I like absolutely unvarnished, complete truth feedback. Just tell me what you think. And I think that request, that pairing, almost to the extent that you can, the way in which someone gives feedback with the student who would best receive it, operationally very difficult, I get. It plays a massive part in it. I mean, again, to reveal a little, we could do a whole thing on teaching evaluations and evaluations of teachers, but I would routinely get, I either love the way Ish gives feedback or I hate the way Ish gives feedback, and that gave me pause for thought, but also made me think, shouldn't we better pair people up? Isn't that part of literacy too? Our own understanding of how we give feedback and how malleable we are in giving that feedback to the sort of students that we've got, or do we have to become more malleable?
Oh, I think this is fascinating. And this is also a thing within feedback literacy of, are we trying to help people get through their studies, which is very important, and or are we trying to prepare them for the world beyond education, where feedback is a really big thing. So we certainly want to, at the start of the degree, be very much supporting people with the sort of feedback that they need and thinking about the ways that they need it. But we want to scaffold them so that by the end of the degree, they're able to cope with the sort of feedback practices that exist in the world of work. In a paper, we refer to that as authentic feedback. We have authentic assessment, trying to represent the world of the tasks that people do in work, in the discipline, in the profession. We might want to think about authentic feedback, the ways that feedback is done in your field, because you mentioned computing. There are traditions of feedback in software development environments that are totally different to the traditions of feedback in surgery or law or design. And people need to be prepared for what those are going to be like. Otherwise, they get a very rude shock in those first few months of work.
Absolutely. The management consultant who starts on the first day and writes an entire slide deck, and they get told the blue is a bit too blue. That's very different to the feedback they'll have received at university. So preparing for them for that, hugely important. Thinking about this with technology, how can we better use technology to drive not only feedback literacy but also the interaction with feedback? What role does technology play in that?
Yeah, so I think there's there's an ability to scaffold some of these good teacher processes. So, you know, things like self-assessment or peer assessment or, you know, gating of feedback comments and grades, you know, like saying you got to look at the feedback before you look at the grade. So, you know, there's possibilities in that sort of space. There's different feedback modalities, you know, like text versus audio versus video. My understanding of the research in different like feedback media is that students seem to appreciate feedback in audio or video modes more, and teachers seem to say it takes them less time to produce feedback in those ways than it does to write it, though I'm not aware of good evidence that people learn more from that sort of feedback. But if we're trying to promote feedback engagement, that matters. I think something really important is if we can have access to data on our students even looking at the feedback. You go back to your paper example. There were a lot of times when I never picked up my assignments, and the teachers would have seen this kind of feedback graveyard of all of these assignments of mine that they'd spent time marking up that I never looked at. But we can have access to data on our students even looking at the feedback. So there's a lot of ways technology can help.
I'm going to move us to our final question because it's the one that I've asked everyone on this season of the podcast, and will be in season 2 as well later in 2025, which is two parts to it. What do you see as the future of assessment, and what role do digital tools play in that future?
I think we are probably going to be seeing a big split between assessment of learning and assessment for learning. I think traditionally we've tried to kind of do both of them at once. So we've said the whole degree is assessment for learning. We're designing it as great learning tasks, and we're going to kind of average your scores across all of those. But I think in our current environment, AI could just do so much of what we have traditionally assessed students doing. So I think we're going to split off some moments and say, we are going to try to secure these moments. I hope we have like 3 to 5 of those moments in a degree because they're quite expensive. They're not that fun. They can be, you know, quite restrictive and all that. So I hope we really try harder to secure a few moments in a degree. In some contexts, that might even see a return to face-to-face exams, though I really hope it doesn't, because I think there's some real challenges for that in a country like Australia where everyone's spread out so much. So we'll have 3 to 5 of those moments, and then we'll free ourselves up to do really cool permissive things. We will accept that people are going to use AI in all these other moments, and we're going to focus on, you know, what can you do? How do we actually raise the standard? Yeah, someone who graduates with a degree in 5 years' time is probably going to be able to do so much more than a current graduate because it's going to be this person plus AI. And we'll explore all of that in these wonderful assessment for learning moments, and we'll secure those assessment of learning moments.
I'm actually going to throw in an extra question because we've talked a lot about the student use of AI. Use of AI that's good for educators. Are you seeing anything out there where you think, okay, this is an AI, this is something that AI can do that will help educators? I can see a good use case for this that actually has, you know, a positive impact on the way that we assess students and the way we give them feedback.
Yeah. So firstly, I want to stress the worst uses of it are likely to be things where individual academics just go and do something like get ChatGPT to mark student work or whatever. Any uses of AI need to have gone through your institution's legal team, and you are really opening yourself up to all manner of hurt in the future that you might not even be aware of now if you just go and use a bunch of random AI tools and upload student work to those without the student's permission. So that's my first caveat. Get it through the lawyers. Now, with that said, I think there's some great things we could do. I think firstly, the assessment design piece, so things like building better rubrics, AI can really help you to build better rubrics. You might need to feed in some things into it so it's got the right sort of understandings of rubrics that your institution wants. But assuming that, yay, go build better rubrics. Making rubrics is an expert practice. We're not all trained in it. So I think there's the assessment design piece. I do think in the future we're going to see offloading of some of the more mundane capabilities of assessing individual pieces of student work. And there we're talking, sentence level, spelling, grammar, structure, writing feedback, all of that stuff. AI can be great with that. At the moment, assessors spend a lot of time on that. I think partly because it's the easy stuff to do. And then we have this cognitive bias towards answering an easier question. Rather than has the student work met the outcomes, I say, has the student written well, which is an easier question to answer. If we get AI to answer the easy question, we're left with the hard one. Have they really met these outcomes, which are so rarely referencing spelling grammar? So I think we're going to be left with some hard work.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Phil, thank you very much for the discussion today and for joining us. It has been genuinely fascinating to turn over these questions with you and hear your views on them. And I want to thank our listeners. If you found this useful, please like, subscribe and share via your preferred podcast platform. And if you've time for a review, that is always welcome. Phil, before we go, is there anything that you want to promote? The peer review, probably playing again on a day when I'm not in Melbourne, but beyond that, anything else you'd like to promote?
Yeah, actually there is. We've just launched a new free online course around how to seek feedback effectively. So this is for anyone who is in a situation learning or working and wanting to really develop those capabilities around feedback literacy, seeking feedback and working with emotions through the feedback process is where it focuses. It's on FutureLearn. If you Google how to seek feedback effectively, FutureLearn course, I'm sure you'll find it. And I'm going to send you a link to chuck in the show notes.
Absolutely, that I will do. I am going to be at lots of events this year, depending on when you're listening to this. I either am going to or have been to Lancaster, Hong Kong, Spokane in Washington, and a couple of other locations that are still to be determined. I really enjoy speaking to educators in all the places I've been to. I was in Australia last year. I'm not going this year, though. And those discussions on the topics we've touched on today, if you want to ask about those or give me your views on those or anything else, always really interested to hear them. So I look forward to seeing you, listeners, at other events around the world at some point this year or in the future. But as I say, that's all for today. Assessment in Focus is brought to you by Inspira, providing flexible assessment with integrity. I've been Ishan Kolhatkar, and I will see you next time.